I'm Maureen, and welcome to my DVD called Oh, See, Can You See? I want to chat with you today about why oftentimes people take ASL class, formal class, feel pretty good about their ability, go out into the community, run into a deaf native user of the language, and are absolutely blown out of the water because they're not able to understand what they're signing. The reason is because when we go to a classroom, we're learning textbook ASL. I want to give you a little example. If you grew up speaking English and a new person came up and said, "Hi, what is up?" Your first thought might be, get out of here. But your second thought might be, obviously, this is not a native user of my language. We tend to put our words together, a little slang, say what's up, but there's not an ESOL class that's teaching what's up. They teach the formal part. So how do you make that switch from the formal part into the slang that native users tend to be skilled with? I want to take an opportunity to discuss with you today some of the things that you will see a native user do, but you are not being taught in a formal class. Now you know also when you grew up, if you were an English speaker in some kind of grammar school, the teacher taught you that a sentence was composed of a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, right? Now you didn't stay speaking in sentences that only had those three parts. You went on and you graduated to complex sentence, compound complex sentence, you used slang, you used innuendo. You learned, you became mature with your language use. And you have to do the same thing. ASL 4 is not the end of your training. So today, with the help of my delightful friend, Peter Cook, I'm going to try to show you some of those mature, subtle nuances of native use of ASL that you may be overlooking in hopes that it will improve your skill in catching concepts that deaf native ASL users are signing when they meet you. Before we see this clip, I want to remind you that your classes are wonderful. I am not criticizing ASL class. Great place to start. If you know deaf people in your community, a wonderful place to pick up ASL. But the goal for me to teach you today is that everything, no matter what you learned, is really a bridge to help you go from linear language, word, to visual language, which is not word. Let me give you an example. This is probably a classic example, maybe you've seen it before. If I say the words, big house, what pops up in your brain? Maybe a mansion? I don't know where you live, so I don't know what your view of a big house is. But in English, when we say those words in that order, big house, we know that the picture that pops up in the other person's head is similar. It may not be the same, but similar. In visual language, if I say to you, if I sign big house, the deaf person's looking going, I don't know what you was doing with this thing, but that house is really small. So that's a habit that we have to try to break, that linear language mindset, so that we can switch over to visual language. And I hope that you will see and have an opportunity to improve that skill with this DVD. One other thing that I just have to share with you, when we go out, and especially people that become a voicer, if you're an interpreter and you're becoming a voicer, but even with ASL students, people picking up the language, they go out and they're looking for the textbook ASL that they learned. People, think of your favorite deaf person. How many ASL classes did they take? Deaf people don't take ASL as a rule. So you're looking for them to be doing something you learned in class, and they didn't take the class. They use the language that they see, they play with it, so you're looking for something that's not going to be there. You've got to remember that this is really a bridge just to visual language. Everything that the teacher has given you is not a hard and fast rule. It's just to help your brain become flexible enough to take in anything visual and put it together and make sense. I have two clips from Peter Cook, and I've broken them into a 45-second part and a 6-minute part. The reason I did that first is that the 45-second is an introduction. He is having a presentation at a community college, and in 45 seconds, that man uses over 20 ASL features. 20. I'm not talking about signs, 20 signs. I'm telling you that ASL features, there are over 20. I've made a list of those, and they're going to appear on your screen. Look them over. Some you may know, some maybe not. This profession always kind of laugh a little bit. We're always changing the names of things. Perhaps you know these concepts with a different name. I remember a long time ago when I came into the profession of interpreting, there was a phenomenon called minimal language skill. And for years, everybody called that minimal language skill. Then one day somebody decided that that was a very negative label, so we changed it to high visual because it sounds better, but it was the same thing. It took me a long time to realize, oh, we're using a different word. So if one of the words appears on the screen and you're thinking, gee, I've never heard of that, hold on, because after the clip, I'm going to discuss each one, and maybe you know that theory or philosophy by a different name. So, okay. Now I'm going to ask the producer here to show you that 45-second clip after you see the name of what you're looking for, and I'll meet you again after the clip. Gotta love Peter Cook. Okay, so the first feature that I want to discuss with you is attention getting. Now, you may have noticed what he did. He comes out on the stage and he signs, hello, 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 hello. Well, that's appropriate in this situation. He's a performer. He's addressing a group in the audience. But that's not what you will always see, obviously. That kind of attention getting changes. But just as it's equivalent to as when we are speaking in English, you just don't walk up to somebody and start, boom, talking about what you want to say. Normally there's some kind of, some words that we introduce or we transition into what we want to get to the point. So attention getting is done in different ways. You probably learned, the foot slapping or the hello. It'll change. You'll see different things, but there's almost always some kind of attention getting introduction when deaf people start. The second thing was the time, reference. You learned, I'm guessing, time always has to happen in the beginning of the utterance, right? Not. It's true, it often does, but situation determines grammar. And there are occasions that you will see the time move to another part of the sentence. Let me give you an example. If I tell you, if the idea I want to tell you is that I'm going to visit my mother, and that's important part of the information, but the fact that it's happening in 2 weeks is more important. Maybe I've been waiting to go see my mom, so I don't have to, I'm not required by the rules to say in 2 weeks I'm going to see my mom. But ASL tends to like to put the punch at the end of the sentence, the most important thing. So I could, it's my right to sign, I'm going to visit my mom when 2 weeks. I can do that. So Peter has the today. Fine, so he does have the time in the beginning, but I wanted to warn you that when you're out and around, it doesn't have to be, it's not a rule that's required. Okay, the next word on the list was lexicalized fingerspelling. That's one of those words that we've changed through the years. A long time ago it was called loan signs. Loan signs. But now it's called lexicalized fingerspelling. You may not have caught the one that he uses. Let me explain to you about those. It is a fingerspelling that has come out of the fingerspelling arena and changed something. It either drops a letter, or it changes palm orientation, or it adopts its own movement. And maybe you know early or job. That's considered a lexicalized fingerspelled word. He uses, now maybe you learned that as a sign, but it actually is the D-O, 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 okay, so that's one that he uses. And then he has a gesture. It's not one you're going to look up in an ASL dictionary and find. He uses the general gesture of, interesting to think about how you might voice that if you were a voicer, but that's a different DVD. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so he uses a gesture. Then he's got a head affirmation. Often when I work with students, I realize that they are concentrating and focusing on the manual part of the message so strongly that they completely overlook the head non-manual marker. Deaf people often, their head is either going yes or the no, and you do not want to overlook a negation. So as you are learning to watch and see, make sure you're seeing the whole picture, not just the hands. Then we have Verb Directionality sign. If you went to an ASL dictionary and you looked up the word involved, you would see a picture that would look kind of like this. Involved. But Peter doesn't do that. Did you catch what he did? He reaches out to all the audience members and he involves them. So if you were wondering what that, you hadn't learned that, it's simply a verb being given in a directional manner because they're the ones he wants to involve with him, not you involved here, because the involved, you're not over there. So that's a visual part of verb direction. All right. Pronoun. I often tease people and say I would become a rich woman if I could invent a pronoun pill. It's one of those things, they're just these little words, but we often misuse them, drop them, and then people are left thinking, who did what to whom? Now, Peter uses his pronoun by establishing what I call a sweep, by pointing all out to the people. He just doesn't say you, he does the plural you. So he's got a pronoun establishment there. And then, eye gaze. Perhaps you saw, sometimes we see it happening and we don't even analyze why he's such a good signer. This is one of the reasons. When he says it would be very tough for all of you to be on the stage, he doesn't just keep looking at them and say stage. Turns his head, looks where it would be tough to put them. So that's an eye gaze move, and the whole audience just is drawn right into the product he's making. So if you can learn to use your eyes that way, your product, your expressive product will improve as well. All right, now, mouth morphemes. A morpheme is the smallest unit of language that has a meaning. Here's the bad news. You can't just put them on there unless they match the meaning you wish to accomplish. So oftentimes when I see people learning, oh, I know pa, cha, but they don't realize they can only be used for certain situations. So a pa, we learn it as successful or finally. But it cannot be used on another situation. The same thing with cha. You can't have a doesn't work. So mouth morphemes have to match with meaning, and you can do a lot, you can continue studying mouth morphemes for a long time, but in your own product, be checking. Now, Peter, of course, uses them perfectly, and he's got a few of them in there. I think tough and the group, when he goes, that thing, meaning a large group. So he's got a good example of a few mouth morphemes in there for you. Next, we have distributional aspect. Now there's a big word for it. It's a verb repetition, and he's talking about picking people from the audience. But he doesn't just do pick, pick, pick. He does, well, maybe he does it one-handed. I'll have to look at the video again, but he moves that around. And that's what that feature is called, that you're taking the verb, you're moving it around so you understand that it's not happening just in one place. You're giving that visual clue. The next one is direct see it all the time, but I want to discuss with you the feature and how it works in ASL. The two ideas is that we have direct address and indirect address. English speakers normally use indirect. So I tell you, oh, I called my mother the other day and told her I had a haircut, and she was really surprised because she knows I like long hair. That's indirect. If I spoke in direct address, it would sound like this. Oh, I called my mom the other day and I said, Mom, guess what? I got a haircut. And she said, Maureen, you did not. I know you like long hair. Now, how long could I go on like that without you going, excuse me, I have to leave? It's kind of like what I call a valley girl dialogue style. However, deaf people use it often, and Peter fades in and out of this beautifully. You may not have even caught it. It's when he takes the role of the people raising their hand or sitting in the audience going, I'll just watch. He's actually doing the ASL feature of direct address there. He's going into the role of the other people. Now, when the next one, narrator's spot. Oh, I wish I could teach a whole workshop. Maybe I will one day on this feature. Eye use is so incredibly important. And, you know, Peter is master at this. So when he finishes that direct address of being the people in the audience sitting there going, no, I'm just going to watch, the next thing you see, he comes right back and looks at you. The narrator's spot. You know he is no longer acting the people's part in the audience. He's now himself picking up with the rest of the show, with the presentation. I bet that you caught the rhetorical question. He uses a rhetorical, and he uses it as, on this part, it's goal. Did you see him sign goal, goal? And then he tells you what his goal is, to play with language. If you are a beginner, let me remind you that you must answer rhetoricals. You don't just throw them in there for no reason. And I have said, don't laugh. I've seen people that we learn oftentimes the open-handed rhetoricals. Sometimes we learn for or why, but often I see people using the open-handed rhetorical question. But remember that the purpose of a rhetorical is so that you are baiting or hooking the people's interest. It's like for, now you're sitting on the edge of your seat waiting to say, why, and then for the answer to come out. So it's really a hook, and he uses that as a hook, and he goes, what's the goal? And before you can think, I don't know, what's the goal? He answers, playing with language. The next feature I call abstract, absent, referent. You may have learned indexing, where you point like father there, mother there. That's indexing. But here, that is the person, we use it because the person's not there, they're absent. However, if you have something that you can't really place, like language, ASL is not a person, but it's not here, so we use it. A language is kind of an abstract idea, so we have an abstract, absent, referent thing. And he uses a space. Right after he uses the rhetorical question, he says, ASL, puts it over in this area, that. He doesn't say ASL, That I love. His that goes right up to that place where he had referred to ASL. And then he uses an ASL concept sign. Did you catch it? We call it kiss, fist, love. After that, you may have noticed he uses a listing technique that is not one that we often learn in class. Normally we learn the non-dominant hand listing, but he chooses to use like a body sway. He lists 3 things that he became. And I think one is a poet, one is a storyteller, and he's doing this thing with his body that shows you that he's listing. So the body sway has a meaning. It means he's listing things. So don't be expecting to see this. He's not required to stay in that rule. But it's obvious once you know what he's doing, oh, he's making a list. Then we see him getting ready to make a transition. He's finished discussing why he's there, and he's about to jump into something else, so he needs to make a transition. The way you realize that is that he does sign first, but he takes a step forward. And to the uneducated eye, they think, oh, well, his feet are tired and he's just moving around. No, that step forward has a meaning that you have to be able to catch if you want to understand. It simply means he's stepping out of what he just did to start a new thing. We're going to see it again later when we see the 6-minute clip. I'm going to show you how he uses that in the story as well. Peter uses the honorific. It looks like this. Some people sign down and up. Sometimes you see it just down, down. That is a wonderful way of introducing a person or yourself. It's very ASL-like. We kind of learn, my name what? That's cute. But again, it's that elementary level, and on the mature level, you're going to see people doing. And then they go off for an explanation, and he does it to himself. You can see it if you're watching somebody deaf signing. That means they're talking about that person, and they are getting ready to tell you something about that person. You don't just do it, oh, this person is there, and then go off onto another subject. No. It always is used as an introduction reference. And very briefly, perhaps you saw him use a topic comment. Did you catch it? Right after that honorific, he says, deaf culture must explain. So he starts the sentence with deaf culture, that's the topic, then he switches to say, the comment is you have to explain yourself about who you are. At the very end, you saw him using a verb repetition. That is information. You have to give it's like this, inform. We learn one down here, one up here, inform, and he's just, here's an answer. Perhaps you've seen that with that verb directionality that I talked about. He asks a question and people, you will see that if you were to see the whole videotape. I don't think I'm going to use it in this clip, but that's a sign for people in the audience throwing answers. So that's the end of that list. And now, I'd like to show you, for you to see, the 6-minute story. I'm going to put up on the screen 10 more features, not the list that we just looked at. But there are 10 more features that I'd like to share with you and see if you can catch them during the 6-minute story. It's a funny story. is a funny man. Okay, so let's discuss the 10 features that I picked out to show you to make sure you didn't overlook. First one I'm guessing you saw, and it was the finger spelling. I wanted to put that on the list because it's always interesting to me how often those of us who are learning ASL later in our lives are absolutely overwhelmed by fingerspelling. I'm one of them. I'm willing to admit it. Fingerspelling always gives me a hard time. And then I started researching why that is happening, and there are whole entire courses and articles you can read. I'm not going to bore you with my research here, but I will tell you this. Oftentimes, people fingerspell fast, they drop letters, and there are many reasons for it. Sometimes they're just not patient fingerspellers. Sometimes they assume you're going to guess the word anyway, so they just shoot through it. Sometimes it's a big word and they're not really sure how to spell it, so they just boom real fast because they're hoping you're going to understand what it means. So don't always beat yourself up because you missed the fingerspelling. Relax, realize that the more you read, the more you know about deaf culture, the better you are at guessing what just flew past your eyes. All right. Peter makes what I call an editorial comment, and I know it has other names, but it's the part of the story. He makes a few of them, but the one that I caught that I think you can see, he's talking about what he ate for lunch. And he goes through maybe 4 items. And at the end of that list, he does this very hard to catch if you're not looking at it. It's just a little move, and he makes the comment, that's interesting. They were all brown. Now, it would not belong in the regular part of, as you're catching it, you may be thinking, what is he talking about over here? But if you recognize it as an editorial comment, you're like, oh, he's just adding a little something in. It's not really a huge part of the story. It popped up in his brain while he was telling the story. That's interesting. They're all brown. And then he goes right on with the story. So don't let that throw you for a loop when you're trying to fit in, how does that meet with all the things he's listed that he was eating? He didn't say he ate something brown. He said that all the things he had eaten were brown. Then, one of my favorite parts, he uses some deaf humor. Did you catch the Clark School thing? With the this, that turns into the lips, and he does it just beautifully. I couldn't hope to be able to copy what he did. But I would like to give you one kind of a word of caution. Language is dynamic, and it's always changing. But there are a few things that are really deaf, that hearing people, even though they're learning the language, are not really, it's not a comfortable thing for you to use. Deaf people would not be happy to see hearing people learning the language using it. So, for example, things like, and it may be changing, maybe one day that won't be the situation anymore, but right now, I notice often people tend to catch the ones that are so cute, like, which means profoundly deaf, but that is really for deaf people. That's their language to use, that's their sign to use. Hearing people being respectful should use profoundly deaf. Same thing, there's another one, this one. Think hearing, the person thinks he's hearing. That is really a terrible insult for a hearing person to say that about a deaf person. There are certain groups of people. It would be an example for us would be white people cannot use the N-word. But black people in their group, if they want to use that with them, they can. That's not considered as offensive as a white person using that. It's the same kind of thing. So this stays in the deaf community. They use that with each other, and we, hearing people, stay away from that. Anyway, so Peter has this deaf humor this tongue wagging and then the lips opening and all that kind of a thing. So I recognize that. The next feature is story setup. Often we overlook how deaf people tell us that they're starting a story. He's pretty clear. He says, one day, well, that's very nice of him to give us that information that he started a story. But as you go out and around, often what you see is, and that's the equivalent of the English, one day I bump, 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 bump. So the happen sign is telling you I'm getting ready to tell you a story. Another cute thing that Peter does is to play with the language. You know the sign for strict. Strict. But does he just do strict or even this? No. He does it with 4 fingers. Now, you will never see that in a book. But it's beautiful, and you understood it, I hope, because you now get the bridge. To the visual language, and that is so visual. You understood immediately what he meant, and that's playing with the language, and it's allowed. Next on my list, we have classifiers, and there are many, but obviously, clearly done when he is describing his teacher with the glasses and the little bun. Oh, so cute. Anyway, classifiers all over this story. Next, contrasting. Now that is one of the 7 features that are being taught now, very popular, of ASL that we tend not to use in English. It is really the bane of all voicers because the deaf person sets something up and then tells you it's not that way, it's this way. So if you were to say you wanted the chairs in a horseshoe, then ASL, one way that it could be done is chairs so by the time you're looking, saying, wait a minute, I thought he just said they were in rows. And then he said they're in horseshoes. I'm confused. I'm telling you, that's a feature called contrasting. They tell you what it isn't, and then they tell you what it is. And it's done for emphasis. So in just viewing it, be aware that that's the feature being used. He uses audience address here. And it's important for you to notice it because he walks out again from the spot. He was telling a story and he makes a comment, and then he breaks the story plane. He steps out of his story and addresses the audience, and you have to catch that so you know this is not part of the story. He moves forward, he looks down at the audience, he has a little interaction with them, then when he steps back, he's back ready to tell the story again, and that's a visual part that you have to catch. Often when we go to a formal class in ASL, we're taught that our signing box is here. Were you taught that? Remember that it has 3D, it has depth also. Now he has a special way of changing the topic here. There are many ways to change the topic. He's in the middle of his story, and then he thinks of something that he would like to get close with the audience about so they will understand the next part of the story. So again, he steps out of his box, and if you don't catch that, you don't get the rest of what he's doing. He starts asking them about the game when he's talking about the hand up on the head. And he's asking them, have you guys ever played that game where you put your hand on your head? And some of the deaf people recognized that, especially if they went to a residential school, they recognized and understood the meaning of that hand on the head thing. So once he checks with the audience and he's seeing how many people out here know this, and he goes off and he talks about how hearing people do punch buggy or different things that hearing people do. Now he's got them all on the same page that it's a game, and he steps back into the story and uses that for helping you to understand the remainder of the story. It's a change in topic. Now every story has to have an end, but often when we're watching, the deaf person will look at us like we're supposed to have gotten it. We don't realize that the story ended. So I want to show you what he did to help you understand the meaning of the non-manual markers, the things that are not on his hand. He didn't say the end, but he does something that allows you to understand, oh, it's over now. He holds his last sign for a few seconds. And then he explains that's the sign for father. And he holds it. And he looks out at the audience as though to say, get it? I got kicked out for signing. Get it? Then he goes on to show the audience's reaction. He shows that to them. And then he comes back with kind of a, I made my point. And that's how we know it's the end. Well, thank you for spending this time with me. I've really enjoyed having a chance to analyze some of the nuances of ASL. Many, many thanks to my friend Peter Cook for allowing me to use his clip. Can't find anyone better. At the end of this DVD, I'm sure you will find his contact information. If you would like to contact him to come give a presentation to your area, feel free to use this contact information. Now, if you are an interpreter and you are wanting to learn some tips on how to voice something like what you just saw, please check out my DVD called, Oh, see, can you say? I was born hearing, and at the age of 3, I contracted spinal meningitis. It damaged my hearing, and I became deaf. Now, of course, just like all hearing parents with a deaf child, my parents didn't know what to do. So they thought they would take me to a deaf expert. But the person they went to was a doctor. He didn't know what to do. But he checked me out. And finally he decided, if you would like him to fit in the hearing world, you'll have to send him to an oral school. So they sent me to Clark. Have you ever heard of Clark School? That was the school I went to. Now in that school, you were not allowed to sign. They really emphasized speech and speech reading. And I went there for about 9 years. And I do have a story from when I was in that school. Now let me tell you, I was a good boy. Oh, I was innocent. I followed the teacher's rules. I always did what the teacher wanted. I turned in my homework on time, went to class on time, had good attendance. I was a good boy. What are you laughing for? No, it's true, I was a good boy. But one day I got thrown out of class. Well, the reason I got thrown out of class is a little bit embarrassing, but I'll tell you, it's because I farted. You're surprised to hear that, I see. No, honestly, it's true, but let me explain what happened. My school was in New England, Massachusetts. So for lunch, I would eat things like French onion soup, baked beans, some butter on the top. Ooh, they were good. And they also have up there bread that's called Boston brown bread. It's peppered with raisins throughout. Oh, did I love that stuff. And for dessert, we had chocolate pudding. That's interesting. All the food was brown. But anyway, so I ate my lunch and I was walking down the hall and my stomach began to have a party. Oh, I had so much gas and I was trying to keep it inside. Now, let me tell you, when I would go into my math class, I had a teacher named Miss Rainey. I will never forget her. She wasn't just strict. Strict. It was awful. She was this little old lady with funny glasses and a bun, and she'd walk in, and her mouth would just keep moving. I didn't understand a word she said, but I knew what she meant. So I sat down, and I was quiet. I still didn't understand her, but I behaved. My classroom had tables that were not set up in the way you would expect to see in a classroom. Rather, they were in a horseshoe shape, so that the students could look at each other when they were talking. We each had a set of headphones, and in the front of our desk, there was a dial, and the wires to the headphones would go up. There was a microphone, and the sound would go over to an amplifier box that had a gauge on it that you could control the sound that was going in the students' ears. That was the way it was done in my school. So back to my story. So there I was sitting, and I was trying not to be embarrassing myself. But finally, I just had to let it go, and I farted. And I tell you, it was so loud, the books were falling off the shelves. So it went over to that microphone, and it was so loud, the children with their earphones on were starting to jump off their chairs. So you know what we did? We had a little silly game. Now, perhaps you know this game. Well, actually, hearing people tend to have games too. Like when you see a Volkswagen bus, what do? You do punch buggy. Or perhaps if hearing people are chatting and they say the same word at the same time, they smack each other and say jinx. It doesn't really work with people who can't talk that well because even if you call their name, they don't hear you. So that's not a good game for deaf people. They can't talk, so they never do that jinx game. But our game instead, we would play that if someone farted, wait, let me ask, maybe you know this game. You say, excuse me? No, that's one idea, but that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's what it is. You put your hand on your head like a 5. Anybody who went to residential school, do you remember that game? I tell you what, let's practice it right now. Everybody, put your hand up on your head like this. You see that lady over there? She's the last one to put her hand up. We're going to blame her for farting. That's our game. So anyway, back to my story. I was in math class. And there I was sitting there trying to hold it all in. But it was not going to work. And finally, I just let it go. And the books fell off, and the sound went up to the microphone. It made the dial move, and every kid in their chair just jumped up and down. We all began to put our hand up on our head because that was the game. And my teacher at the time was writing on the board. And she heard all this. And when she turned around, she smelled all this. The classroom had all boys in it. And she began to spray some kind of air freshener. She put the can down, and then she took a look. And she started to reprimand us when she saw our hands all up on her head. She said, get out of here and go to the principal's office. Now maybe you're curious why just putting my hand on my head would send me to the principal's office. But it was because that was the sign for the word father. So I got thrown out of class for signing. Can you believe it? Sure enough, I see you're amazed, but it's true.